My name's Alex. I'm from a company called Comuzi. We're based in London. A lot of our work is working with companies to sort of prototype emerging tech products and services that look at the intersection of emerging technology and humans. So this is me on a
conversation with access stimulation.
Yeah, what is topic 11?
Help me out.
Sure, I will help you out.
I want some chicken still.
I got jerk or fried chicken.
Yeah, jerk please.
Yeah, you want a jerk?
With a can of Coke.
It would be 2 pounds for the jerk chicken.
Thank you for your help.
No problem. Take care.
Bye.
I don't know if anyone's here, so that was going to come like after this slide, but I don't know if anyone's here that's gone to a Caribbean like restaurant or shop before and ordered jerk chicken. Has anybody here had jerk chicken? Okay, that's a great number. I was about to say you're missing out on getting some good chicken. So essentially a lot of my days is building like emerging tech prototypes, and what I was doing there in that example was just trying to frame, it went really viral on Twitter, LinkedIn, and different social networks, and what I was trying to do was just frame an argument about, you know, that was a very, how do we sort of look at minority languages and incorporate that into voice interfaces or conversational interfaces? You know, that would be more natural if we were trying to make voice a natural interface. It would be necessarily be more natural if we were to have like more of a Caribbean accent in a house, and that kind of like sparked off a debate and conversation. But my role at Comuzi is the co-founder and head creative technologist because I spend a lot of my time designing and coding.
Alexa, do male and female brains exist?
Sorry, I'm not sure about that.
The problem is, quite simply, language. Science, whether in the lab or in the living room, can't escape our existing sexist culture.
We sort of like created a data set of 840 billion words that was sourced from the internet. And in that data set, we sort of identified bias in regards to the themes of race and gender. If we were to use the data sets, we would be suggesting our feminine users very stereotypical job roles like stylist, like nurse, like homekeeper, which is sort of reflective of society's stereotypes that we have today.
When it comes to gender, simple answers.
You know, and so that essentially, that was kind of me with a really corporate voice on the sky, super corporate voice. I took like so many takes and I kept like failing. And so I really did one with like clean and everybody's like, yeah, this is great, this is great. And I was proper anxious and I saw myself sounding so wonderful on Skype. But that was essentially, a lot of my sort of research has been around racial and gender bias. And that was talking about gender bias where we had like sourced a number of words on the internet and sort of tried to put it in like, create this fake CV service using this data. So all you had to do was put in your name, and it was basically highlighting like you know, if your name was, you know, Kelly, for example, that can be, you know, stereotyped as a feminine name, and you can get job roles. So we were looking at how, you know, when we talk about AI and how that sort of is mirroring our, you know, negative human actions and our thoughts and systems. I'm just checking through the slides. Oops, my slide has disappeared. Okay, it's coming back. Cool. So normally, when I always talk about AI, I normally always have this first slide up. Like if I'm doing workshops on public facing, you know, talks, I always have this slide up because it's always like, what's so special about these things? And these are like majority of applications that we use every single day, and they are all powered, you know, or enhanced by some sort of sophisticated algorithm, you know, which essentially helps us. You know, I use Spotify quite a lot. It suggests me new music based on the music I do. I, you know, watch Netflix quite a bit. It suggests me new, you know, stuff to watch based on what I'm, you know, currently watching. You know, all of this is using sophisticated algorithms, you know, impacting and also improving our lives maybe in every different shape of ways. But why do I show this a lot? Because especially when we talk about artificial intelligence right now, where it's like the most overhyped and least understood, trendiest technology about right now, a lot of times people's perceptions of artificial intelligence is like Terminator and stuff, and I'm like, dude, it's right now under the software that we use every single day. And so for me, it's like, when I think about what is actual the go of creating AI, this was essentially like the go in like 1950s in the summer proposal where a bunch of people wrote this proposal about artificial intelligence, which is I like to call it the art of how to make computers do things that which humans are currently better at. And I have an issue with this particular type of definition or these thought processes and why we have to actually create things that apparently make computers do things that what humans are currently better at. And this is what my talk is currently going to be about today. So the title of my talk was Algorithms and the Life of Brisha Borden. So in 2014, this is a young woman called Brisha, based in Florida. And she happens to see a bike. She does then take the bike illegally. And she gets arrested for it. And Brisha was a bit of a naughty one. You know, she's been in trouble a couple of times. And what had happened was that, you know, the court system in Florida had adopted this new software. And this software was a particular type of one, which is like, yeah, hey, judge, you're struggling. We're going to have this software that helps you make decisions faster and better. And that's essentially what the software was framed at. It's called Compass. And it was basically used to determine who is most likely to reoffend based on, you know, data and statistics. However, a really investigative journalist from the publication ProPublica essentially was doing research around this and trying to understand, you know, racial bias in AI systems. And when I have these two comparisons on the screen next to me, and so Brisha, who said the bike was essentially high risk, and then compared to Vernon was essentially somebody called low risk. And if you could see over there, it might be pretty small, but Brisha only had like 4 juvenile misdemeanors, I probably said that correctly. And Vernon had 2 armed robberies, 1 attempted armed robbery and 1 grand theft. However, based on comparing those two, Brisha was seen as more high risk and Vernon was seen as low risk. And you know, throughout the research, they sort of identified this. If we bring this to Robert was essentially, had 1 petty theft, Robert was seen as medium risk, and you had James, who had 1 domestic violence, aggravated support, 1 grand theft, 1 petty theft, 1 drug trafficking, and 1 grand theft, and he was considered low risk. And you know, for me, when I first approached this article, I think like 2016, 2015, I was quite interested in it. And I was thinking to myself, okay, cool. As somebody who works in technology and also is an academic as well, I can't necessarily make something around this investigative report and like try to challenge it from academia thesis because it will be seen as too journalistic. And so I further then started exploring how did they get to this data set? And I found out that when essentially how the software works is that somebody gets arrested, you get put, and you get this survey, which has like 137 questions. And so you who is like been arrested or in trouble, you basically fill in this survey here. And the survey then gets, you know, calculated, and it gets, you know, it's used as what feeds the algorithms to give the output to the judges. And this is really interesting, because why the survey doesn't take race into consideration, it does take into particular questions which could compare to undertones of race. And this was a very interesting thing. So I've highlighted 2 questions, which are pretty small, but it asks a question: if you lived with both parents and they later separated, how old were you at the time? I grew up in care. I grew up in the care system. So for me, I'd be like less than 5 because I didn't have that. Or I grew up in South London. I grew up in Peckham. And I think Alex earlier on was talking about working with somebody from South London, where, you know, now South London is a bit trendy, it's gentrified. But before, it did have this sort of media press about itself due to knife crime. Well, we still have it now, and different topics. But there was questions there where it was like, it asked questions: how many of your friends or acquaintances have ever been arrested? Have many of your friends and acquaintances served time in jail or prison? How many of your friends and acquaintances are gang members? How many of your friends and acquaintances are taking illegal drugs regularly? And if I was to use this in context of my life, I could mark the most. You know, because I grew up in an area, I grew up in a state where my neighbors were involved in this type of stuff. However, I would then be seen as a high-risk offender, but I don't necessarily, I'm a big friendly giant. Well, I like to see myself as a big friendly giant, you know, but that's how I see that. And I was very intrigued by, like, you know, this thing. Even though, like I said, it doesn't take race into situation, but it does take nuances of race. You know, living in Peckham, South London, majority of the people were, what would I say, Caribbean, African, ethnic minorities who predominantly live in that area. And ever since that situation, I'm a bit pissed, you know, I'm in a particular situation. And so I spent a lot of time looking at the US because it's only recently where, I'm gonna touch on the UK because getting data here was pretty hard. But in the US, up to the 70s, race, nationality, and skin color was actually used in to guide judges on sentencing decisions until somebody basically identified that it was like a human rights issue. In 2016 alone, over 1 million individuals were sent to prison, a majority are black. In 2014, Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, writes a speech that risk assessment scores are biased, you know. And so, what happened, once this investigative piece was written, there was a number of media press about AI ethics, bias in algorithms, and loads of conversations about ethical design, ethical technology, responsible technology that came up. And so a particularly group of PhD researchers basically wrote a piece and was like, you know what, that person that wrote this investigative piece is chatting loads of rubbish. You know, they don't know what they were doing, their data sets was really bad, you know, and then, you know, when you think of it as an academic, if you've got a bunch of academics saying this, and you've got somebody who's not an academic that's researchers wrote this report on this, most of the time you're like, ooh, which one do you weigh? Which one outweighs more? And I was very super intrigued by this. Even the company that developed the software wrote a whole paper about it and was like, look, our software is super accurate, trust us. We know what we're doing. However, one of the challenges is that for me as an external researcher, you can't have access to that algorithm. You don't really understand how it works. You understand how the data is being fed because it is this algorithm, this software gives this organization a competitive advantage. And that's something to really consider for, if we want to introduce these things in the UK, what is the flaws of using for-profit companies to basically be able to give us advice in criminal justice? And then in 2018, a bunch of people did research on the software again from an academic standpoint. And they basically concluded that Compass software is no better than a bunch of us making decisions on who's more likely to reoffend or not. So which kind of challenged the whole notion of, yeah, we're using AI and we're using software in this particular type of situations. And so similar to the lie detector, which isn't really, you can't really use results from the lie detector in court. I kind of said, why should we use AI in court as well? And so it was to develop some sort of similar framework and terms. And it was proprietary software, we should have guidelines on the limitations of the software, which is making it clear that there was a non-disclosure of implicit information about the risk factor or the scores that are calculated. Or that risk assessment scores are established in group data, which can designate people as high-risk offenders, but not as high-risk individuals. And when I talk about looking at me and my situation growing up in Peckham, South London, if they were doing a risk score assessment on myself just for risk assessment score sake, I'd be seen as a high-risk offender, not a high-risk individual. But how many times do we really distinguish that in a situation? It shouldn't be used for sentencing because it has been used in sentencing decisions in the court. There's tons of law papers on this that's been done. It should be considered as an assistant tool, so maybe a judge wants more clarity, but there still should be that need of human subjectivity and not feel like this software is the guidance, the holy grail. Is it holy grail? It's holy grail, yeah. To sentencing decisions, making sure that it measures to a national sample and doesn't look at a local population. And so, in my day-to-day work, I spend a lot of time working with organizations, especially the big tech companies, around inclusion, equity, and artificial intelligence. So one of these things we did, I partnered up with an organization called Fearless Futures, who I don't know how many of you in the audience have heard of them before, but they do a lot of work around bias, loads of work around inclusion and design. And they're really good. They really had the theoretical, the structural knowledge on bias, on inclusion and equity. And for me, coming from a technology standpoint, understanding how AI works or how algorithms work, and we kind of merged the two together. So we spent a lot of time bringing different tech companies together to a workshop. So we had the likes of Microsoft, We had a team from Google DeepMind working on the Streams healthcare app come in. We had a number of different technology companies come in, and it wasn't like to do this separately. We wanted it to be like a big groupthink exercise. We did a lot of exercises on like bias. It was really uncomfortable, getting people out of their shells to have a conversation about this. And like listen to Sam and listen to Holly's talk, and we're looking at how can we create, ethical design principles or ethical ways of thinking, or maybe asking ourselves, what if? Because sometimes in technology product design development processes, Sam showed the example of the work process. Why don't we map out a time to talk about the ethical impacts of what we're doing? Or maybe sometimes even in our design decision, asking what if, because that's like a really important thing. And so some of the things we kind of came up with is that AI isn't really solving anything. It just makes our bad human decisions faster for us. Fairness is really subjective. So bringing it back to the crime sentencing area, fairness is a very subjective thing, Maths can't achieve that, and we need to remember about the importance of human subjectivity in these type of things and not just depend on, an algorithm or to decide this for us. Accountability is algorithms and AI is complicated. So for example, who's accountable? Compass detached accountability for their software being used. Is it the judge that's accountable for making that decision? Is it the software company that's accountable for making the decision? Or, and is it the data? We're using data that has already been biased and it's already drenched in powers of systems and oppression. And the question is, how do we sort of, I don't think we can remove bias. So we can't just say, yeah, let's just remove it. But it's being able to identify that, look, our data sets necessarily might be biased. And how do we limit the impact of bias, which is something that I'm trying to frame and work. More conversations on bias is needed, and it's also important to create conversations between multiple disciplines, people who have knowledge in historical qualities, culture and social areas concerns, working with those who do also understand the technology as well. And also working with a diverse team. That's been a big conversation right now. Diversity and inclusion is a hot trending topic right now. But also building teams who have those diverse experiences would be able to address insensitive and underinformed trainers of algorithms by AI. Because I know for me, if I was working in that team, Compass, coming from my background and my experience, I would basically bring this up and say, it's a bit problematic what we're doing and we need to identify better ways. Maybe we need to always remind these judges that this is just an assistive tool. This isn't exactly like you should make your decisions of this. And that could just be a simple text box there. That's a very simple design thing to implement, but that can go a long way. And bringing it back to Brisha, I don't condone what she's done. She did do wrong. But I think it's very important for us to be aware of, yes, we want to advance, we want to enhance. We are technologists, we're very big about enhancing, improving, and want to do stuff. Like I'm up for that. But it's also important to remember, what is that thing happening? It's not only about talking about empathy, but it's also talking about compassion as well. How do you have compassion for somebody else that you're building for and shaping that experience? And I think that's like one of the few things I want to leave here with. And just leave here with this quote. It is extremely important for an audience interested in AI to recognize that we take a social welfare system and we put on top of it ways to make it more efficient, that what we are doing is doubling down on injustices. And I think, that's a very important thing to think about, that AI isn't just only touching on the ethics side, because we have tons of conversations on the ethics side, like really in the States and sort of growing here. But we also need to talk about the human rights sides as well. And there needs to be more conversation about that. And I hope that many of us here who's come here to talk about GoodTechConf, and I know that day 2 is like prototyping and working and stuff. How can you prototype ideas which could contribute to talking about how do we, touch on the human rights side in regards to emerging technology? And so, bringing it back to the UK, what's recently happened, or happened 4 years ago, is that the Met Police has now created a sort of gang metrics. And what that's essentially meant to do is to sort of identify who is in gangs, or I like to identify who's a gang member, to identify the families of those who are in a gang member, and essentially identify the victims of gangs. And so recently, this has been coming up in the press on how the gang database shared victims' data. So people who are victims of knife crime or different things could be found out through this, how it breached data protection laws, how the ICO has found, that it's breached data protection laws, and how Amnesty International's been like doing a big sort of campaign against the Met Police about this. And so now my next go is just really about trying to understand how did they put this gang matrix together, what was their thinking decisions, what was the data they had already, what was the steps they wanted to take. It is pretty hard to try to get information out of this, but that is a goal, because a lot of my data has been US specific and I'm not in the US, and I want to create impact here. If we do need this sort of database, then cool. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's make sure that we've built this database in the right way, and it's effectively done, that it's done in the ethically best way that we could do. In our working community, one of the things we built was something called like an AI cheat sheet. If anybody wants to know 20 terms, explaining 140 characters around AI, because like I said, it's one of the most least understood things about. Everybody talks about it, throws loads of buzzwords, but people really don't understand it. This has been used 43K times across the globe, and it was just like a simple tool that we made in like 2 days to just bring some information out. We do a lot of these sort of like public facing workshops, just getting people to immerse themselves in prototyping AI futures. It's just really fun for us to do. I've been working on that. I had like a video, but I don't think it's in this slide because of the technical difficulties. I made like tons of slides to share. But we've been working on a project which is looking at designing a feminist Alexa. So we're creating like 8 prototypes looking at feminist Alexa, gender neutral AI, and that was like working with a project called the Feminist Internet. And we're presenting that in like December, like 8 different like personal intelligent assistants that have like been created and to prototype a feminist response. It's very interesting, the term feminist AI. What does that actually look like? And that's been like a very theoretical thought piece. There's loads of work around that as well, and we sort of are bringing that to life. I don't know, this is so small you can't say this, but I'm like an academic as well, so if anybody wants to read some of the stuff that I touched on, this slide can get sent to you, and you can like, I know you lot are taking pictures, I hope you can zoom into this slide exactly, but thank you, that is me. I hope that was simple to understand, and we can answer any questions. Thank you very much.